I found my wife on the dance floor, getting cozy with some guy. What they were doing hardly looked like dancing. Obviously, she had had too much to drink. I approached them, quickly pulled her arms off his neck, and started to lead her away. "What's going on here, man?" snapped the guy she was dancing with. "I'm her husband, and we're going home," I told him. His initial readiness to resist me disappeared almost instantly. "Take her, she's all yours," he muttered dismissively. "She's no good in bed when she's drunk anyway." I asked, "And when she's sober?" "Then she's fantastic. Just ask around. Everyone agrees she's top-notch." Someone opened the door as I carried her to my pickup and drove to her parents' house. I laid her on her bed. She was already out of it, likely gone even on the dance floor. Without a word, I left. Ruth is my older sister. Esther Jacobs is the other. My brothers are Adrian and Henry Payne, and I'm Louis Payne, raised by Southern Baptist parents in Vonore, Tennessee. We grew up attending church regularly, with limited exposure to TV or radio, and our parents only read the Bible. We grew up in poverty, determined not to follow in our parents' footsteps. After high school, leaving Vonore was our goal. Ruth and Adrian moved to Nashville, while Esther and Henry stayed in Madisonville. College wasn't an option for us. Ruth found work as an assistant cook in a diner, and Adrian, despite challenges in truck driving school, succeeded. With help from an instructor, he secured a job driving for a Nashville Star, a position usually reserved for seasoned drivers. Adrian excelled as a truck driver with a great personality. After high school, I received a 4-year Army ROTC scholarship to Vanderbilt University and was commissioned as a second lieutenant upon graduation. My first assignment was in Korea with the 8th Army, where I stayed for 13 months before returning home for a 30-day leave. I then reported to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. During my leave, I visited my family and spent time in Nashville with my sister Ruth. Adrian was on tour driving for a Nashville Star. While staying with Ruth, I met Gerald Thompson, her boyfriend, and his sister Debbie. Debbie and I started dating, and by the end of my leave, we were in a relationship. Since Fort Campbell was close to Nashville, we spent a lot of time together. We had closeness on our 4th date, and it became a regular part of our relationship. Eventually, we got married. After 18 months, our time at Fort Campbell ended, and we were transferred to Germany. The move was a big change for us. Debbie joined social clubs, learned bridge, and we traveled throughout Europe. In the last months of our tour, Debbie developed a taste for European wine, while I, raised in a household where alcohol was absent, never developed a liking for it. Our next posting brought us back to Fort Campbell, which made both of us happy. We settled into government housing and enjoyed about 6 months of contentment. Then Debbie began spending more time in Nashville. We'd visit for the weekend, and she'd often want to stay an extra day or two. Those extra days soon turned into 3 or more. By the end of the year, Debbie was practically living with her parents. I would visit on weekends, and one Friday, I arrived early only to find Debbie wasn't home. Her parents didn't know where she was. I had arrived right after lunch, since I had finished work early. Debbie's mother explained that they hadn't expected me so soon. As I was about to take my overnight bag to Debbie's room, her mother tried to stop me. "Give me a chance to tidy up first," she said. I replied, "It's okay." The room was a mess, with dirty clothes scattered everywhere. I noticed that the bed was covered with dirty clothes, but appeared made and unused. It was clear the bed hadn't been slept in for a couple of nights due to the pile of clothes. Her mother was picking up some of the dirty clothes and kicked a pair of her underwear under the bed. I managed to get her out of the room by saying I needed to use the bathroom. After she left, I retrieved her underwear from under the bed. I found 2 more pairs, and took them as well. One pair had what looked like white seed on them. I sat on the bed and examined them, but I couldn't bring myself to smell them to confirm. Taking them to the living room, I showed them to Debbie's mother, who had just finished a phone call. I held up the underwear and asked, how long has she been seeing other men? Her mother responded, I think that's something you'll need to talk to her about. I went back to the bedroom, grabbed my overnight bag, stuffed the underwear into a side pocket, and headed toward the door. Her mother asked, are you coming back? Not bothering to respond, I left and drove straight to Ruth's house. Although Ruth and Debbie's brother had stopped dating a few years ago, they remained friends. Since then, Ruth had married Eric Wyndham, who owned a music store. Debbie and I had returned to the States for their wedding. While heading to Ruth's place, I called her, and she told me where to find her hidden key. She was busy and couldn't chat, but mentioned she wouldn't finish work until midnight, said she had to close the restaurant that night. Once I arrived at her house, I tried calling Debbie, but got no answer, so I left a message. This is your husband, the only man you're supposed to sleep with. I need an explanation for why that's no longer the case. I also want to know how many other men there have been. Eric came home around 7, and I filled him in on everything. Ruth called a bit after 8, informing me that her ex-boyfriend, Debbie's brother, had just heard from a friend that Debbie was drunk and flirting with several men at the Count of Monte music bar. He was heading over to pick her up and take her home. Ruth told him not to worry because I was already there and would handle the situation. When I dropped Debbie off on her bed, both her parents were present. Her mother began to blame me, saying that Debbie's actions were my fault because I took her to Germany, where she learned to drink and engage in all sorts of undesirable behavior. I glanced at them briefly, walked out, and returned to Ruth's house. Eric and I talked until Ruth got home, and then the three of us stayed up talking well past 3 o'clock in the morning. I crashed on their sofa. Again, I woke up at 7 o'clock, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat on their front porch, preparing myself for a conversation with Debbie. Ruth and Eric joined me around 9 o'clock, and we continued talking for another hour. They wanted to know what my plans were, but I told them I hadn't figured it out yet. The next day, after 10 o'clock, I rang the doorbell at my in-laws' house. Debbie's father answered and let me in. Debbie was on the sofa, sipping a cup of coffee. Approaching her, I placed the stained underwear on her coffee cup. She picked them up, threw them on the floor, and took a sip of her coffee. I asked Debbie why. Before she could answer, her mother interjected, "You don't need to answer that, sweetie." "Stay out of this," I replied coldly. "Why?" I asked Debbie again. She looked up at me and said, "I needed to be loved, and you weren't around." "How many times have you needed love, and I wasn't here?" I pressed. "How many times have you cheated with other men?" I repeated. "I don't know," she responded. "Take a guess," I urged. "Maybe a couple of dozen," she said hesitantly. "How many different men?" I asked. "I'm not sure," she said. "Take a guess," I insisted. 6, maybe 7, maybe 10. "I'm not really sure," she answered. "Does our marriage mean anything to you?" I asked. She looked up, stared directly at me, and took another sip of her coffee without replying. Walking out, I returned to Ruth's place and quickly told them what had happened. "Did she show any remorse or offer an apology?" Ruth asked. "Nope," I replied. "Wow, she's really cold-hearted," Ruth said. I thought the same thing, I agreed. With no reason to stay in Nashville, I decided to head back to Fort Campbell. On Sunday afternoon, I was surprised when Debbie walked into our house. I was lying on the sofa, and she sat on the armrest where my feet were. After a few minutes, she said, "I'm sorry." "Don't say another word. If your only excuse for cheating is that I wasn't around when you wanted closeness, that's pretty pathetic. You deliberately stayed away from home so I couldn't meet your needs. Instead of coming home to your husband, you chose to get drunk and sleep with strangers. That's a terrible reason to ruin a marriage. Your parents are just as responsible for this as you are for letting you behave this way. The only thing left for you to do is pack your things and leave. I don't want to leave. I've apologized and promised it won't happen again. I don't care if it happens again. To me, we're no longer married, so you can do whatever you want with whomever you want. All I care about now is you leaving. I picked up the remote and turned on the TV. She snatched the remote from my hand and hit the mute button. I'm not leaving. You're my husband, and this is my house. She threw the remote back at me and walked out of the room. While she prepared dinner, I made a sandwich and ate it in the living room. She stayed in the kitchen and ate whatever she had cooked. When bedtime came, I took my shower and went to bed. She followed, took a shower, and tried to snuggle up to me as closely as possible. Do you honestly think I would sleep with you after you've been with 6 or 7 or 10 other men? I apologized, she said. And you think that makes everything okay? Yes, you really need help. I can't stop you from sleeping in this bed, but I don't have to stay here and think about all those other men being with you. I went to the living room and slept on the sofa. When I woke up, she was sitting in a chair watching me. I ignored her, took my shower, shaved, put on my uniform, and went to work. After checking in at work, I spoke with my commander and updated him on what was going on. He advised, if I were you, my first move would be to see an attorney. Take all the time you need. That day, I consulted with several lawyers before choosing Kirby Dickinson, a retired Army lawyer. He understood the unique challenges faced by military personnel. He asked, what exactly do you need from me and why? I need your advice because I'm completely lost, I replied. Are you interested in trying to save your marriage? He inquired. No, I said firmly. Why not? He pressed. Because she cheated, and I can't accept that in a marriage. How do you know she was unfaithful? He asked. I explained the situation to him. That kind of information doesn't hold much weight in court, Lieutenant, he said, noting that I was now a first lieutenant. She could claim to have slept with the Army and Navy football teams in front of a packed stadium and then deny it in court. Unless you have concrete evidence, a judge might believe her story. He shook his head. Those are just the facts. After a pause, he continued, so since you don't want to save the marriage, I'm guessing you're looking for a divorce. Is that correct? Yes, sir, that's right, I answered. And you probably want to make things difficult for her, correct? Yes, sir, you're right again. Great. I appreciate when clients agree with me. It reinforces what I already know. And what's that? I asked. That I'm a smart son of a bitch, he said with a grin. We both laughed. Here's my advice, he continued. If she's living with you, give her the cold shoulder. Ignore her no matter how much she screams, yells, or throws things. Hopefully, she'll decide to leave, either to go back to her mother, her boyfriend, or somewhere else. When she's gone, she'll probably return to her old ways and find someone new to sleep with. All we need to do is have someone there to record it. Even if the judge rules that we can't use the video, it will still show that you're telling the truth about her infidelity. I'm pretty confident that the court will rule in your favor. That's how it usually works in Kentucky. The downside to this plan is that we need someone available around the clock to film her activities, which won't be cheap. However, I'm confident this will benefit you in the long run. Are you on board with this? Absolutely, I replied. Good. First, write a check for my fee, and then another for the private detective. I'll arrange it for you." Although I felt reassured, I also felt poorer. When I returned to my office that evening at 6, Debbie called, but following Kirby Dickinson's advice, I didn't pick up. When I got home after 10, Debbie was there waiting for me. She asked, "How long is this going to continue?" I have apologized. Let's just go back to our normal life. Ignoring her, I headed straight for the shower. 20 minutes later, as I settled into bed, I heard her car drive away. Getting up, I checked our shared closet and saw that most of her clothes were missing. I went back to bed and fell asleep. The next morning, I contacted Kirby Dickinson and informed him that Debbie had left, likely heading to Nashville. Excellent, I'd have connections there. Do you know where she might be staying? I gave him her parents' address. Perfect, let him proceed, he said in less than a week. I received a video showing her with 2 men within 48 hours of receiving the footage. She was served with divorce papers citing adultery less than an hour after she got the papers. She called me crying and begging for forgiveness. I ended the call without saying a word. I kept my boss updated on the situation he had experienced something similar years ago. The key difference was that his wife cheated on him while he was deployed in a combat zone. Cheating on a spouse in a war zone is undoubtedly one of the worst betrayals. Next, I informed Post Housing that I was leaving the quarters. The following day, I moved into the bachelor officers' quarters back 3 days later. Debbie called saying she couldn't get into the house. I told her it was no longer our home. I had moved out because she had abandoned me, and as a single officer, I wasn't entitled to Post Housing anymore. But you're still married, she said. I chuckled and ended the call. I figured she'd probably head back to Nashville. As I've mentioned before, I don't drink alcohol. Growing up Southern Baptist, I never developed a taste for it. And that didn't change as an adult. The same goes for swearing. I never got used to using bad language. I don't mind if others drink or curse, but it's just not my thing. In the same way, I'm not odd. Dancing closely with your partner is exciting, and seeing women in revealing clothes can be thrilling. I appreciate the female form, and if a woman wants to show it off, I'm definitely interested in looking that night. However, I used every swear word I knew and probably invented a few new ones. As I watched the video of my wife with 2 men, I played the video on my computer. It began with her dancing on a crowded floor with 2 men. They were behaving in ways meant for private spaces like bedrooms. She was occupied with both men using one hand on each of their pants. The scene continued for several minutes before they left the dance floor, exited the building, and got into a car. The detective followed them to a rundown motel. He circled the area until he found a room with the window open. It was having closeness inside, but it wasn't the right one, so he kept searching until he found Debbie's room. Her window was also open, and they didn't seem to mind. They quickly got undressed and got to the point watching my wife undress in front of 2 men. Felt like a strange dream, but it was nothing compared to what followed initially. I thought she might be drunk, but her words didn't suggest she was. "Come on, guys," she said. "Show me what you've got. I've never done this with 2 at once. It should be interesting." The taller man replied it. "Will ho, you'll have more guys in and out of you than you could ever imagine." She paused and said, "Don't call me that. I hate that word." The shorter man stepped out of his shorts, walked over to her, grabbed her hair and yanked her head back. "You're a hoe, and we'll call you that," he said, pulling her hair again. He made her kneel. "Now do what you need to do, ho." She reached for him and took it into her mouth. The tall man then grabbed her hair, pulling her off the shorter Minnow my turn, Hovey said she complied. The short man said, Ho do BJ, don't they? She kept continuing he pulled her off. Again and repeated it. She nodded, you're doing my Johnson, what does that make you? Aho, she almost whispered, I didn't hear. You, she repeated loudly, she continued to. Do that to both men alternately until. The tall man pulled her toward the bed. Oh my God, she moaned, and almost passed out. They lay side by side for several minutes before the short man spoke. That wasn't bad. Do you want more than two? Guys had her from both sides. Simultaneously, there were screams, but it didn't stop him. After a while, this screaming stopped and moaning started. Then she started moving. I pushed the pause button. I shut down my computer, feeling overwhelmed. Her behavior was beyond rational explanation. She claimed that her need for love drove her to cheat, but that excuse seemed one of the weakest ever given. When I confronted her, she didn't even try to deny what she had done.